Yes, if I do this as a long series.
Oh, children, you can come out. Sorry, I forgot to dismiss the children.
If we did this as a long series, I might give a lecture on the mathematical infinite as a device for formulating analogies and illustrations of what God is like. Or I might give a lecture on Gödel's theorem and mathematics and logic and the nature of thought. Something sure to put you to sleep on a warm, sunny afternoon. So, I set a groundwork this morning for how we're going to think about what we learn from the sciences and how we're going to, in some way, put that together with our faith. Make them work together to our advantage, to our benefit. And I propose that we use the golden rule as the basic way to handle it. We're going to treat the sciences as we would like them to treat us. Give them a fair hearing, learn from them what they can, even listen to them when they tell us that we're wrong or foolish. We might disagree with them at the end, but we might also discover that sometimes we are being foolish. One of the things the sciences do fairly well is they dissolve nonsense. It's sort of like this solvent, and you mix thoughts in with it, and science at least dissolves the nonsense. It might not know everything or figure everything out, but it's pretty good at dissolving nonsense. So I thought we'd pick for tonight some meaty stuff to think about in terms of where faith and science might interact some, or where we might have to do some thinking in order to put them together in our own minds. Will someone get ready and dig up in a Bible, some fairly standard translation, Genesis. And I'm going to want us to look at Genesis 1 through 2:4, but we'll get there in a minute. Because of the theory that the universe began in a big bang, there's been a lot of excitement in the last 30 years about, hey, gee whiz, somehow the physicists and the astronomers are sort of proving what our faith always claimed from the beginning, that God made everything out of nothing, because it looks like the Big Bang comes out of nothing. And we'll talk about that later. Before the Big Bang theory, scientists and astronomers thought, hey, the world is what it is. It looks like it's been here all along. It looks like it'll keep going on. We can't see any far end of it. It looks like it goes on out there forever. You know, so God creating things out of nothing is, hey, you know, it's a nice idea, but we don't see anything that, you know, really terribly needs a creator. At least not one with a beginning in time and a beginning in space. But then scientists had their noses pushed in it by the astronomer Edwin Hubble's discovery of the red shift, his discovery that all of the galaxies in the sky, except 4 or 5 of them right close to us, are going away from us. And if they're going away from us in every single direction, then that implies not that they're going away from us, but that everything is expanding. And if you try to figure out why everything is expanding, you end up with the kind of thing that's described in the Big Bang. I'm going to presume that most of you at least know the storyline of the Big Bang. And if it comes to doing the math, I'd have a hard time at that stuff too. So the storyline is what counts for us. So there's been a big revival among Christians of thinking that, hey, you know, physics is giving us a helping hand here. And that's only partly true. It's not completely true. So who's got Genesis handy? Come on, I asked for somebody to get ready. What translation do you got? NRSV again? Yeah. Would you read all of chapter 1 and then up through verse 4 of chapter 2 for us?
Okay. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome, and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let there be lights in the dome of the skies to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And then there was evening, and then there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And then there was evening, and then there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle, and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished with all their multitude, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created.
It is the word of the Lord. So, the fight didn't really start with evolution. The fight started with geology. Long before we knew very much about fossils at all, and had no great idea of what a wide variety of life had lived before us, the fight started with geology. Because when the geologists studied rocks and rock formations and mountains and the way rivers cut through mountains and all that stuff, they said, hey, this fits, this works, this causes that. But it takes a couple million years to do these things. And the Bible clearly said, hey, God did this, started with Adam. If we count backwards, the most we can get up to is 7, 10, 12,000 years ago. And one guy counted exactly down the ancestors and said, hey, the world must have been created in 4004 BC, in the evening, in April, an early spring day. Just, best he could do by counting. But it seemed clear, pretty ordinary, that as far as the scriptures were concerned, the earth was relatively recent, not much older than human beings, and certainly not millions and millions of years. And before the geologists had been working for 100 years or so, they were pretty sure that the earth might be some odd billion years old. They hadn't settled on the present figure of 4.5 billion yet, but they definitely got to the point of talking about hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions. And that all seemed like it couldn't possibly fit with the story we have in Genesis. And the story we have in Genesis has lots of other things that became a problem as the sciences got further along. I mean, the days and the time it takes, and what sort of sense there is to how the days fit together. I mean, you couldn't really build a world that way unless you were like painting it. I mean, if you're painting it, you could paint the light first, a big wash of pale white, and then paint in the sun and the stars, paint in just an earth and a sea, and then gradually add air. And so you could do that if it was a painting. And then at the end, you just, touch the painting and it would come to life. But not if you were building it up with ordinary geological processes. Not if you were letting it develop according to the rules and the laws that you put into it. And the description the scientists were giving was of a world that developed and changed according to laws and processes that were built into it. Now, it's easy enough for us to say, hey, those laws and those processes come from God. That's what we mean when we say God created the world. He didn't just create mud and bricks and water. He also created laws and rules and logic and necessity and the laws of physics and such. Okay? But that's a place where we've worked our way up to. Because in the beginning of this misunderstanding, it just plain looked like the scientists were saying, hey, it couldn't have happened that way. You've got the water and this dome and the idea that the world was created in a chaotic ocean, and we opened up a bubble inside of it where we stuck land, that the plants come into existence before the sun does. Where's the sunlight for them? And all the living things being created all at once. By the mid-1850s, Darwin hadn't figured out a theory of evolution yet, but the evidence that there had been all kinds of strange animals living on the earth long enough ago that no human being had ever known them, long enough ago that they were only found buried in the ground, long enough ago they were only found buried in the ground in layers that were built up on top of one another, and that would have taken hundreds of millions of years if they were built up by the same processes that the geologists were studying that were going on right now. That variety of life was already there before we actually had a theory of evolution from Darwin. And yet Genesis talked about all the life having been created all at once. And it didn't say that 90% of it died off before Abraham was called, during those early days. Classic answer used to be, hey, that was what the earth was like before the flood. All of that stuff is pre-flood. The geologists shrugged and said, okay, we can find places where there looked like there were floods here and there, but if it was one flood that did everything, how come we've got stuff in dozens of different layers with consistent patterns of animals here and there? So, we got these classic responses of faith to what the scientists had to say about Genesis. And eventually, Christians wanted to come to some sort of agreement. There used to be a movement called Young Earth Creationism. The idea that the world is what science describes it as, and it's been working like that ever since God created it, but He did only create it 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years ago, something like that. And a great deal of ingenuity was put into describing how things that we see now could have happened in only 10,000 years or so of God's doing things. I think that part of our problem is not science, but how we understand how to interpret the Bible. The Bible is full of a bunch of different stuff. For instance, did you ever hear anyone suggest that the Bible teaches us that when we dry our dishes after supper, when we're washing up, we have to turn them upside down at some point in the process while we're drying them? Did you ever hear that? It's a rule in one of the Jewish kosher keeping patterns, and the rule comes from a line in Scripture. In Jeremiah, in one place, he warns the people of Jerusalem that God is not going to let them escape the way they think he will just because they're the children of Abraham. He says God will turn Jerusalem over the way you turn a dish over when you dry it. That's where that line comes from, and why some of the rabbis said, aha, this means that God wants us to turn our dishes over when we dry them. I don't think so. I think Jeremiah was spouting poetry. And the poetry was poetry he received, was inspired to by God, but it was still poetry. He was talking about justice. He was talking about the evil the people of Jerusalem was doing. He was talking about the self-righteousness with which they assured themselves that their city was not going to be thrown over by the enemies that surrounded it. He wasn't talking about how to wash dishes. And then we have parables, too. When Jesus says, there was once a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And as he went, robbers set upon him and beat him and stripped him and took everything he had and left him there for dead. When Jesus says that, nobody thinks that he's citing a newspaper report from out of the Jerusalem Times. Everybody knows he's making up a story with a very special shape, because it's designed to catch us napping and reveal to us that we're not acting like neighbors to the people we meet. It's a story shaped to his needs, and it tells some truth. Jesus says to the disciples on the night of the Last Supper, he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. That is, I'm the way to get to God, and it's a way that comes to you. I'm the truth. Whatever is true, it comes from who I am. Here I am, a human being, and I am truly God. But wait a minute, God is bigger, beyond, more than, wildly greater than human? True. But also, as much as, or in as, or however it is that God is human, he is human in Jesus, and that's true. There's a relationship. That means that when we call something true, we always have to be aware of what is the relationship between one thing and another. Because truth functions in between as part of language. And if we don't know what the relationship is, what the context is, then we don't know what the language means, and we don't know how it's true. Jesus also says, I am the life, meaning this is what it really means to be alive. So I think that a handy way to think about Genesis is as though it is a kind of parable. And the parable has some definite things to say. The parable isn't going to describe the math that you need to work out to describe crazy things like what happened in the first 1/1000th of a second after the Big Bang. The parable's not going to describe the path integral with which you figure out whether or not an electron and a photon are going to interact. It's not going to deliver a copy of the periodic table of the elements from Mendeleev, but it is going to tell you something true about the world. 1, God made it. 2, God didn't make it out of stuff. God made it out of his own decisions. God made it out of his own choices. God made it out of his own creative determination that this would be it. I mean, we read in the Bible, God said, let there be light. It should be translated, it really should be translated, God commanded the light to be. That's how those phrases should be translated. It's because they're in a thing that we don't have in English, which is the third person command form. We don't have that in English, but they do have it in Hebrew and in other ancient languages. And so we've come up with this kind of soft and squishy translation. I think the more forceful way to translate it is God commanded the light to be. So, one of the things that Genesis tells us for utterly sure is that things are what they are because that's what God created them to be. And if it looks like, when we study them, that they've got some inner rule or inner law or inner essence or inner nature that makes them behave the way they do, the things we commonly call the laws of chemistry and physics, or whatever you may have, the laws of physical optics, and just the whole smear of scientific stuff. If it's got a nature, God invented that nature. God created that nature. That was part of what it meant to create that stuff. So whatever there is, and whatever rules it's got, those rules aren't what you have instead of God. The rules of physics aren't what you have instead of God. They're what God did by making this universe. For the world was made for us. Is designed to be a place that we would love and love to be in. That's why I stick these mountain pictures in these presentations. Not just because my name is Mountain, but the truth of the matter is I probably love the mountains more than I love all of you. I hardly met you, barely could call you your friends, acquaintances that we could probably become friends if we had time for it and lived in a nearby place. I certainly don't love the mountains more than I love my wife and kids and grandkids or even my closest friends, but I probably love them more than I love everybody at a greater distance than that. This world was made for us to love it and be loved by it and to discover it and explore it and to find out what it was like and to make it into all kinds of incredible things. I mean, if you told people 10,000 years ago, hey, this world belongs to you and you're going to discover its secrets in such a way that someday you'll be able to smash open some rocks, melt out some stuff, melt some silicon, turn it into glass, and create stuff that will talk to you, that will let you talk to one another on the other side of the world, have intricate tiny details so you'll need a microscope just to see the thing you invented and designed and built and so on. They would have said, you're getting silly. You're getting silly. Go to bed. You need a nap. The world was made like that so that we could do that. Now, it's easy for science to say, hey, that's just the way it is. And that's all right. But we are Christians who are trying to understand what it is the sciences tell us and how we're going to understand what they're doing. We know that the world was made for us and that we were made for the world too. That traditional translation of Genesis has the idea of fill the earth and subdue it. And that's there. Have dominion over it. That's there too. But also, in the next story of Genesis, it says God took the man and his wife and put them in the garden to till it and to keep it. And to keep it also means to guard it, as well as to flourish it, to design it, to plant it, to make it grow. We were meant for the world too. And all of these things are true, no matter what details about the order things happened in you may come up with. And whether it took 13.7 billion years or 10,000. And whatever we may find as we struggle to put different molecules together and make new chemicals, or discover new stuff about how bodies work and save lives with medicines and maybe even gene splicing treatments someday, I don't know. Maybe we can do that. It looks like we're certainly going to try sometime soon. I hope it works. But all of this is for us a gift from God, not just what happened, not just, things sort of bumped into one another. And if you bump things into one another for 13 billion years, some interesting stuff pops up sooner or later. You can only say that if you're making the assumption of metaphysical science. Oh yes, what the sciences learned is true and nothing else is. There is nothing else. You can only say that if you're making that assertion, the assertion of metaphysical science. The mere fact that you discovered that the redshift means that the universe is 13.7 billion years old doesn't mean that there's nothing else or couldn't be anything else, or the universe couldn't have been anything other than that. That's merely your discovery of what it looks like that it is now because of what it might have been before. So, there's another way to look at it too. This way was made up by a lady named Dorothy Sayers. Does anyone know who Dorothy Sayers is? Okay, someone. Dorothy Sayers did most of her productive work between 1920 and 1960. She was a writer. Her father was a clergyman in the Anglican Church. She went to Oxford and got a job at an advertising agency as she got out of college, and then became a writer and wrote mystery novels, detective novels. And then later, when she made enough money on her detective novels to switch fields, she went back to writing Christian stuff. She had been raised as a Christian. She was a believer. She wrote plays about Jesus that were performed on the radio. She wrote articles, some of them scholarly, about theological things. And this was one of the ideas she suggested. She said, hey, the world could well have been created 6,000 years ago and still be 4 billion years old. That was how old they thought it was in her day. She said, it's not really hard to imagine. In 1922, she said, I invented Peter Wimsey. Peter Wimsey was the detective in her detective novels. And I invented him 32 years old. I invented him having been born in 1890. I invented him already having a past. There's no reason that God could have created the world 6,000 years ago, because He created, 6,000 years ago, He created a world that was already 13 billion years old. Ready. Ready for people to come forth upon it. Now, she wasn't actually suggesting that that was actually the case. She was just saying, look, it could be. Imagine it. What we mean by God creating, and especially by God creating out of nothing, is that God could create anything, including creating a world that's already 13 billion years old. Or, just as much, God could have created a world that He developed for 13 billion years, and Genesis be telling us the things we need to know about that. And the things we need to know for the sake of our souls are not the details of how long it took or how many ages of dinosaurs they were, but rather how we're related to God because of it. The idea of creation out of nothing is the center of our Christian understanding of creation, because it wipes out a number of nonsensical ideas. Some of the scientists have suggested that the Big Bang doesn't mean that God created the universe out of nothing. The quantum froth could have created the universe out of nothing. This is an idea that quantum physicists have, that even nothingness has this potential to become something. And in what they call the quantum froth, things can appear. And most of them are small and they appear and disappear suddenly. But in the randomness of an endless time, sometimes bigger ones appear. This just happens to be one of the big ones. But that doesn't work. That quantum froth isn't actually nothing. It's nothing material plus the laws of physics. The laws of physics are already there. Without the laws of physics, the nothingness doesn't pop virtual particles into existence. It doesn't froth in such a way that a scientist can imagine the world suddenly exploding into being as a Big Bang. Even their idea of nothing isn't the kind of nothing that we're talking about as Christians when we say that God created the world out of nothing. The way they do it, the laws of physics amount to a kind of God. this is the way the world is no matter what. It's a law built into it, so that even nothing can become something. I don't think that works, and I think that's one thing that we've got to understand if we're going to come to some sort of a way of looking at what we're learning from the sciences that can be a whale of a lot of fun. I love what I read in astrophysics, and not so much the stuff about the Big Bang. I mean, you know, there's only so much stuff you can do in the first 300,000 years. But the stuff in the billions of years after, and the way galaxies develop, and quasars and black holes, and so I think that's all just a lot of fun. And I really enjoy it. And I'm pretty sure that they're probably mostly sort of kind of right about those kind of things being out there. A lot of it is developed on evidence that's kind of thin, but it's real evidence, even if it's thin, and they've thought about it as carefully as they can, and they have the virtue of good scientists. When they discover new stuff that proves that they're wrong, they change their minds. And they fix their theories and make them explain things a little better. And sometimes it's a big change, and mostly it's a small change. But they have the virtue of being able to change their minds when they discover they're wrong. I find it helpful to think that what I learned in Genesis applies to the world no matter what the scientists come up with about how it got started or what it's like. And I'm certainly not beholden to the Big Bang for proving that maybe Genesis is right. If they determined that on scientific terms the universe had lasted forever, I would still say, excuse me, but that doesn't explain why it exists instead of nothing existing. And Augustine always insisted time is a creation of God, not some mystical reality that's beyond the world and that even God is subject to. No, God created time. So even if the world was eternal in physicists' terms, the eternity of it would be the time that was created with it. And it would just mean that it goes a long way back and a long ways forward. But it wouldn't explain in the least what it means to exist instead of not existing. That would only be explained to us by our faith. So, I want to talk a little bit about evolution, because evolution is the thing that really, really got the fight between science and theology burning. The important thing about Genesis, I'm not going to give you too much history. I mean, there were precursors to Darwin. For 200 years before Darwin, they've been discovering these fossil remains of animals that nobody ever saw anymore, buried in the ground, looking like they were hundreds of millions of years old. And later, when they started tracking the ages of these things, it looked like there were developments and changes in some sort of sequence. What Darwin did was put the sequence into an order that could be understood, and he gave them something that they hadn't had before, and that was a mechanism, an idea of how it could happen that animals changed from one kind into another over a long period of time. And it wasn't until he got to the point of explaining how it could happen without God reaching in and working it with his hands. It wasn't until Darwin explained how it could happen just naturally by a combination of random events, genetic inheritance. Actually, all Darwin knew about was inheritance. The idea of genetic inheritance was added into the theory later when we discovered genes and DNA and stuff like that. Genetic inheritance, random shuffling of that genetic inheritance, and the survival of what works. Whatever works when you mix up bits and pieces of animals works. And if it works, the animal stays alive, and if the animal stays alive, then it has children. And if it has children, well, then that's a combination of genes that's going to reappear and reappear. And the fight started not because the scientists said there was evolution. Before Darwin, a lot of Christians were able to say, hey, look, I'm not a young earth creationist, so I'm perfectly comfortable with the earth being 4.5 billion years old. And, all right, the animals changed. God was busy creating the world to be what it would be when the time came to bring us to life. So, no surprise The animals changed and developed along the way. What sparked the fight was when Darwin said, hey, no God is needed to do this. A little random variation, a little natural selection of whatever works and keeps things alive, that'll describe, all by itself, sufficiently well, what happened, why it happened, and how it happened. And Darwin, by the way, believed in God, but he wasn't a Christian. He believed in a creator God who made all things, including the rules of the universe, and then let the universe run to see what would happen. Because he knew, in large part, what would happen because he created it to become interesting. But the actual mechanisms, these were just natural. They're what happened along the way. And theologians and preachers and believers blew their tops about this. It was not the development, it was not the long age, it was the idea that random causes were what substituted for God. Throwing dice. And the ensuing fight got nasty. People called one another names. There were famous debates between T.H. Huxley and what's his name? Sam Wilberforce, who was a bishop in England at the time. Goes on to this day. There are still states in the United States where occasionally they try to legislate that evolution shouldn't be taught, or if it is taught, then a Bible-style creationism has to be taught alongside it in the schools. That happens. You've seen it in the news from time to time, unless you haven't been paying attention. And a lot of scientific people think that's proof, once again, that religion makes people stupid. But I want to go somewhere with this, and I want us to read in Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 through 9 now. You still got your finger in the Bible?
Yep.
Read us that.
Okay. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the day that Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there is no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth, and water the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Thank you. Notice, and in this story God's going to go on after this, and he's going to create a bunch of animals and bring them to Adam to see what Adam will call them. Even in the Bible itself, the Scripture isn't worried about sequencing all these events and which animals were made before which, and were the birds made before the insects, or so on, because right there in 2 chapters worth of Genesis, we fiddled around with the story, with the parable, juggling the order of things. Right now, we started with man being created first, and then all the other stuff being created for him. In the previous chapter, we started with man being created last to inherit everything and get it. Obviously, the sequence there is not the word of the gospel in those words. But I want us to think of this text, because I think this text is going to be useful to us for coping with understanding what evolution is and learning how to gain some advantage from it. Because when it says that God formed man from the dust of the ground, do we think that it was like making mud pies? And that he touched the mud stick clay figure and, like Pinocchio, turned him into a real boy? Not even the ancient Hebrews pictured it that cartoony. We mean that God made human beings out of the stuff that was there, whatever that stuff was. That stuff appears to be a bunch of complex proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, fats, some ribonucleic acids, some of which are arranged in complex patterns that contain a pattern for how to make us. That's the dust of the ground. That's actually stardust. Practically everything in our bodies, other than the hydrogen up through, say, the oxygen and the nitrogen and so on, everything that's more than that, further up the periodic table, every heavier element than that, was made inside of stars, somewhere out there, billions of years ago. Stars that had to blow up and scatter that stuff throughout the rest of the universe in order that our planet and solar system can form with that stuff in it, so that God could make us out of it. If that's not the dust of the ground, I don't know what is. Dust of the ground sounds like a pretty good metaphor for that. But the issue that's raised in evolution and in the fight over evolution in the faith, the real issue as to what it means is this. Are we just animals? Are we just animals? This is what the preachers and the theologians got angry about. Darwin seems to imply that we're just animals. Are we animals? Because what Genesis tells us, if we quit worrying about the time sequence and so on, if we're not worried about millions of years, it does say, hey, we're not just animals. God gave us something extra, special. Breathe the breath of life into us is a phrase that has more meaning in it than we recognize in the translation, because in Hebrew, to breathe is the same word as for wind to blow, and it's the same word as for spirit. The spirit that makes decisions and choices and moves this flesh and breathes and blows if it wants to, by choice, by decision, by speaking language, by figuring out some math. All of these are spiritual realities. That's something Genesis teaches us that we have to assert is true, even if we're willing to go along with the idea that God might have developed this flesh that we wear by using some sort of process like evolution. Does anyone here know who B.B. Warfield was? B.B. Warfield was one of the two Princeton theologians who invented the theory of biblical inerrancy. You're familiar with biblical inerrancy, right? Are others of you heard biblical inerrancy? It's the theory that the Bible must be inerrant. There must be no errors in it, not even spelling mistakes, but definitely no mistakes about scientific details and how many Israelites there were and how many days it took to do anything. B.B. Warfield was one of the guys who invented the theory of biblical inerrancy, and he believed in evolution. He didn't believe in Darwinian evolution, but he believed that the earth was millions of years old at least, and that animals had developed. He believed that God guided and managed the whole process all the way along to make it come out the way God wanted it to. But he had no problem with that, even though he was one of the guys who invented biblical inerrancy, because what he didn't invent was literal interpretation. The theory of biblical inerrancy does not imply literal interpretation of the Bible. Parables are interpreted as parables. Poetry is interpreted as poetry. Legendary stories are interpreted as legend, and history is interpreted as history. And you never turn the resurrection into a legend, because it's not intended to be. The way it's written makes it clear that it isn't. But some of the other bits and pieces may be legend. The idea that there were giants on the earth in those days. You interpret the Bible as inerrant, but not as literal. Although actually, going back, Augustine, St. Augustine, everybody knows, the famous theologian from the 4th century, Augustine wrote a whole book entitled A Literal Interpretation of Genesis. A literal interpretation of Genesis. And he covered the first 2 chapters of Genesis. And Augustine, interpreting Genesis literally, clearly didn't think that the world was only 6,000 years old. He clearly didn't think that this was 7 sunrise, sunset days. Literal means interpreting according to the words. And if the words make up poetry or stories, then interpreting them literally is interpreting them as a story, not interpreting them as though they were a news report. or an engineering document. Evolution has been an enormously successful theory because it explains an enormous amount. And it's helped biologists understand all sorts of stuff, and some of the stuff it's helped biologists understand has helped doctors understand stuff, and all of us are likely to live longer and be happier and healthier while we live it because of stuff that people learned, some of which goes back to the theory of evolution. It explains a lot about human behavior. It doesn't explain about sin and the fall. It doesn't actually explain why we're so wicked. I look at the data of evolution and presume that it's pretty much true. And the kinds of animals we're descended from, or the kinds of root animals that both us and other animals that we know now are descended from, and I can't see any natural reason in the world why we should have some sort of genetic coding to run around killing one another like we do. I don't think anything but the fact that we're spirits as well as animals, and that those spirits got separated from God, can possibly explain just how wicked we are. The mere assumption that we're only animals doesn't do it. Animals don't behave like that. Animals don't behave like that. They're vicious, but they're not cruel. They don't understand that they're causing pain, and they're not trying to. And though they sometimes fight one another, surprisingly often the fight ends long before death. Very few animals, almost none, run around killing one another the way we do. And certainly the ones we're closest to in our evolutionary background don't. Sin, the fall, that we are spirits as well as flesh, that we have a spiritual soul as well as this evolutionarily created dust that we call flesh. That's what explains the wickedness. It explains the goodness too, but it's easy to find explanations for goodness. Sometimes people are a little troubled when I point out that one of the evidences that keeps me believing my faith is just how bad we are. You read the news too, right? Even today, even right now, even this year and last year, in India and Indonesia, more than 100 Christian pastors are murdered every year for their faith by people who are trying to get rid of Christianity because it's that other religion that those other people believe in. It shouldn't be here. Do you follow the news well enough to notice that? Mostly in America, we don't notice that. If they don't kill European and American missionaries, well, it doesn't make the news. If they just kill native-born pastors. Sorry, that was a sidelight, but one that I find it hard to avoid. I think what we have to do, if we're going to take advantage of what we can learn from evolution about what kind of a body we're operating, do you read the manual when you buy a new computer or a new laptop? Do you read the manual and find out how to make it work?
No.
Do you read it?
Used to be.
Used to
read manuals. Nowadays it's
My wife doesn't read the manual. Her theory is, this should work so sensibly that I don't have to read the manual in order to know how to work it. So whenever she can't work it, she says, Paul, can you do such and such? Not before I go read the manual, I can't. Evolution, if we pay attention to it, has taught biologists stuff that we need to know about how to operate this thing. There's stuff we need to know about how to operate this thing because we are spirits, but we are spirits in this world through this machine. An extraordinarily complex machine, and even the brain that we're using to think it with is extraordinarily complex, more complex than most computers so far, but it does have operating rules. Some of the operating rules are given by God in the Bible, and they're operating rules for how to be a spirit. Treat others as you'd like to be treated. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. But some of them have to do with the way the body works and how to work it. I think there's useful stuff to be figured out from here. Now, I'm supposed to stop in 10 more minutes, and I probably have 20 minutes worth of stuff to do. What do you want?
20 more minutes.
More than one person has to say that before I'll believe that everybody wants it.
That's the second one.
Okay?
We're Presbyterians. We should vote.
Okay. Let me tell you a story to start with, and then I'm going to get some serious stuff. This is my story in my own mind of how to coordinate and fit together what I learned from what it means to be human from the Bible, and what I learned from the scientists about anthropology, paleoanthropology, that is anthropology in the past, the development of human beings and evolution and all that, as a way of understanding how this body works. This is the story I tell myself. I don't treat this story like Revelation. This is just a story I made up to help me understand how these things fit together. I think that the world probably is about 13.7 billion years old, and that stars exploded in galaxies far away billions of years ago to create the dust that was able to be gathered in this solar system that's only about 4.5, 5 billion years old, so that God could use all these processes of evolution to create the body we have now. And I'm not even afraid of Darwin's idea of random variation, because other people talk as though randomness is the opposite of pattern and cause and deliberate action. Talk to the people in Vegas. They go to a lot of trouble to create randomness, because in order for their business to work, they have to make sure that stuff is random. They measure dice to make sure that they're perfectly random. They measure their roulette wheels. Randomness can be an element of design. You use randomness to help your design fall into place as things jiggle and wiggle around. We do that all the time. I don't see why we shouldn't regard God as doing it too. Because God exerts His control of what the world is from outside the world. From right angles to all of the forces of nature that we know. So that it's almost like God is an author. If an author writes a book and creates a world in the book, the author creates the world from the outside. From the inside, the world looks like it's continuous. From the inside, it looks like everything follows one event from another in the world, even though the author creates it from the outside. Partially, I think we should imagine God creating the world that way, so that every detail of what the world is can be both scientifically determined and also deliberately intended by God. Just a pattern, a way to think that might be helpful. So I think that God created these things from a common ancestor of us and some of the other apes we know nowadays, and built these things up to have opposable thumbs and the ability to manipulate the world and language. That was one of the biggest things God built for us. For probably at least 100,000 years and maybe as much as 1,000,000 years, God was breeding animals that had the machinery for language in them. But then, it looks to me that at some point, just like this second passage we read out of Genesis said, at some point God said, okay, it's ready. Okay, it's ready. And He breathed spirit into one of these bodies. 2 of them. Stuck them in a garden. Started talking to them. That's the first sign of something to be recognized as spirit, that God spoke to them. They now just weren't animals who had a capacity for language to say, hand me that rock so I can scrape this hide, but I love you. I'm the Lord your God. Don't eat out of that tree. You'll get a false idea of what good and evil are. This spirit. Spirit is, we talk about spirit and matter, spirit and nature. Nature is the stuff that is what it is because that's what it has to be. Spirit is the stuff that derives from freedom and choice and decision and action. It doesn't have to be what it is. It is what it is because we chose, because we decided, because we acted, and love, and thought, and feeling, and science, a pattern of thinking, and mathematics. All of these things are derived from acts of spirit, free will acts. At some point, God said, okay, this device is ready, and breathed spirit into them. It looks to me like it took place somewhere between 12 and 50,000 years ago, because that's when we see this sudden explosion of human beings being able to do stuff. All of a sudden now you don't just have an ape with thumbs and a way of communicating in the tribe. You've got them starting to tame wolves. Every dog in existence is descended from the European gray wolf. Domesticate animals, domesticate plants, become farmers, start building cities, create all of this incredible engineering and architecture and whatever. There's an explosion somewhere back there, somewhere between 12 and 50,000 years ago. I think that's about when it happened. I remember now, I'm just telling a story. This isn't revelation. But it's a story that helps me understand how to weave these things together. And as for the old classic question, well, where did Cain and Abel get wives? At the point at which God chose two of them to start as spirits, there were thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands, of this kind of animal out there. Once God had created them with spirit, the infection spread out among the rest of them. It happened as the ones who had spoken with God now turned and spoke to the others. And by speaking to the others and treating the others as a center of will and choice, you really are a you. There's a you in there just like there is in me. That may not be the way you create spirit, but it's certainly the way you communicate it. It's more contagious than a disease, at least I hope it is. Sometimes we manage to pass it on to our dogs. They become almost human for a moment. Or our horses, if we train horses. That's the story I use to explain this to myself, because I've got some uses I want to make of it. You know, our ancestors in the faith weren't afraid of the idea that we're animals, because they didn't think that we're just animals. But they did think that we were animals. Even if God created us magically like Pinocchio, all at a sudden point, He created us with the same ingredients that He created the other animals. This is an animal body. And medieval theologians and medieval pastors had no problem with that, because we weren't just an animal body. We were also a spirit and a soul. And they used to write books about how to train yourself to virtue and to obey God and do God's will. And they wrote the books based upon other books they had about how to train dogs and how to train horses. They literally borrowed those analogies to say, here's how you have to train your flesh to do your will, so that you can do God's will. You have to accept that you're an animal and train your body, like you train a dog or a horse, to do your will. They had no problem with the idea that we're animals. They probably would have coughed at the idea of this flesh being generated by random variation. But that we're animals didn't bother them in the least. I'm willing to buy into that too. And that means that there's stuff that I can learn. And there's stuff that all of us should be able to learn, because look, we're amphibians. Not literal amphibians, they're the animals that can live on both water and in air, but we're spiritual amphibians. We're both spirit and flesh. We're at a sort of a center, tipping point, between the things that are what they must be and the pure spirits in heaven, who are spirit alone and that we presume have no flesh. We're at that sort of a middle point. No virtue to us. God created it that way. But we're spirit and flesh, and everything that happens in our flesh happens to our spirits as well. And everything that happens in our spirits happens in our flesh as well, at least in a pattern of thoughts in our brains. So, I think we need all the help we can get to understand how to operate this machine. And I've been able to get some good at it. So here's some examples of the kind of thing that I've been working towards. I knew a young couple once that was going off to college together. They thought they were in love and maybe would someday get married, and they were both going to the same college together. As a matter of fact, the young man in this couple had gone to a great deal of trouble to get admitted to college out of his junior year of high school. So he never had to go to his senior year of high school and could go directly to college. Got them to agree to count his first year at Penn State as also being his last year at high school. So the couple went off together. So I was talking to them before they went, and I said, look, I'm not asking, and I don't want you to tell me anything about your sex lives. I'm not prying. But in exchange for my not prying, you have to listen to me tell you things that might or might not apply to you. I said, if you go to college and you're in love and you plan on maybe getting married if everything works out, and you've decided not to have sex, which a lot of our church teaches us is probably the way God wants us to deal with this thing we've got, our programming, this urge to sex. I said, if you're going to try not to have sex, I said to the boy, you've got to understand that you've got automated programming in your head that will say, if you're not getting sex, you're not accomplishing your purpose in the world, so this must not be the girl you're supposed to love. I said, there's automatic programming that's going to keep telling you, nope, this isn't the right girl, because you're not having sex with her. Because if you found the right girl, you'd be having sex. That's the automated programming. I said, so when that happens, you just shrug. You say, oh yeah, that's the automated programming. I know better than that. That happens automatically. It's okay. I know better than that. I tell couples sometimes that are concerned with trying not to have sex that, hey, sex is powerful stuff. The automated programming is built in there so strongly that the animals who had it would be sure to have children and more children in the days before we were awakened as spirits. And that automatic programming is more powerful than you are when you don't exert your will. But it's not more powerful than you are when you exert your will. But you've got to know that the automated programming is in there and is running all the time. So if you want to behave in this way or that way or the other way about sex because of what you believe in the Bible, you're going to have to exert your will regularly and steadily, all the time. And that can get tiring, so you might find it helpful. To put yourself in places and situations that give you a respite from having to exert yourself. Go read a book together. Kissing and hugging stirs up difficult stuff. I love kissing and hugging, I really do. And man, when I was 25, I was desperate for it. But it triggers the automated programming. And you got to know that it does, and learn to cope with it that way. Another thing I did with it, I was raising my children. They didn't like to go to bed at night. Did you like to go to bed at night when you were, 13, 14, full of energy? Or do you have children? Do you have trouble talking them into going to bed at night? I said to my kids, look, you are designed with extra strength and extra power inside so that when you need it to stay alive, this was built into you by millennia of genetics, this extra ability, so that if you have to, you could go 20 or 30 hours without sleep if it was necessary to save your life. That ability is in you all the time. And this means that almost every day of your life, you have to go to bed when you're not sleepy yet. Because if you always stayed up until the last limit that you could, you'd always be stretching yourself to use up the extra, and then you wouldn't have any extra anymore. You'd get wiped out. You'd get so wrung dry that you couldn't help but fall asleep. You were built and designed to have extra abilities for special times when things got difficult. This I learned from evolution theory. But it means, in terms of the spiritual fight between father and mother and 6-year-old, 12-year-old, 17-year-old who thinks he can stay up and study till 2 a.m. because he ran around with his friends from after dinner until 11. Hey, almost every day of your life you got to go to bed before you get sleepy. To go back to sex just briefly, because it's such powerful internal programming and because it's so obviously connected to how this automated programming works. Jesus said, whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. I take that like this. I look at the verb, looks at her to lust after her. I treat that as a more active verb. I don't know about you, but at least when I was most of your ages, I don't have as many hormones now as I used to. I imagined having sex with every girl I saw. It was brief, it was short, took 2 or 3 seconds, passed on to the next thing. It's automated programming. I tell girls in my youth group when they go to college, hey, every guy you meet wants to have sex with you. I'm telling the truth, aren't I? Right? Now I said, you don't have to worry about or be scared of every guy you meet, because 97.5% of all the guys you meet are in control of that. It's just a thought that rolls through their heads. They can't help it, it's the automated programming. But it's not automated programming when you type in the URL and call it up on the internet and start watching porn. That's a spiritual disease. The quick flash of imagination when you see a pretty girl walk by in the hallways at high school or college, that's automated programming. Porn is not. I've distinguished between what I learned from evolution and what I learned from the scripture about whether or not you indulge the automated programming, whether or not you give it lust, which is the spiritual dimension. You add lust, which is the sin, to sex, which is the automated programming. One of the things we learned from evolution and medical theory about how our bodies work is that our minds, it takes a capacity of mind to make a decision. Yet I've just identified decisions as one of the ultimate ingredients of what we call spirit. And you can get decision fatigue. And you can get it not by doing incredible, terribly difficult things like, learning to run the 100-meter dash in under 12 seconds or, throw the shot put or play the violin. You can get it going to the grocery store without a shopping list. You have to walk up and down every aisle and decide of everything you see whether to put it in the basket or not. That can be exhausting. So once you know that, you say, hey, I'm still responsible for my decisions, but look, I'm going to make a list first. That way going to the store won't exhaust me. I'll only have to make 5 or 6 decisions in order to decide whether to add something to the list or fill the list differently, instead of having to make 200 decisions in the next half hour. Hey, I've already decided that every day from 3 to 5, I'm going to go out, run around the track, do at least 1 lap backwards, and then go into the gym and spend an hour practicing foil. I did that when I was in college. I make 1 decision, and then I repeat it, so I don't get decision exhaustion doing it over and over again. And the spiritual guides in the medieval ages, the guys who wrote the books about training your body the way you train a dog or a horse, also talked about this, even though they didn't know anything about modern medicine and modern psychology and decision fatigue theory. They said, hey, you make some decisions ahead of time and turn them into habits so you don't have to keep making that decision over and over and over again. You save yourself from the decision fatigue by deciding to obey God. And God doesn't give you every detail of how you're going to live your life. So there's lots of things you're going to have to decide along the way, but there are some things you don't have to. You can rest about those. You're not going to walk the streets at night in Newark and kill homeless men hiding under the bridges. I didn't make that up. There was a guy who did that, Richard something or other. a mafia killer who used to kill people like that for sport when he was in between assignments. You got choices, and you can make some choices that repeat themselves, so you don't have to make them over and over again. You can train them into your flesh and into your brain. Without making a choice or decision, it won't happen at all, but with the right kinds of choices and decisions, you can take advantage of the automatic programming. You can make the automatic programming work for you. You can trick the automatic programming into supporting your decision instead of trying to interfere with your decision. Because I think all of us have experienced that sometimes the automatic programming does interfere with our attempts to make decisions. Those are some of the fruits. I just picked some examples of some of the ways that I've sometimes combined what I know about what it means to a spirit that I've learned from the Scripture with an understanding of what the sciences teach us about the instrument by which this spirit operates in this world. To try to come up with a combination of spiritual, pastoral advice that's also physically and psychologically realistic. I think that we've hardly begun to touch the ways that we can help ourselves do a better job of learning how to behave like we'd like to behave by taking advantage of the way we're really built. So, we end, not in theory. I've delivered you a lot of theory over the course of the days, but hey, here's the kind of practical results you can hope to get out of the theory. There's lots more of them out there, and among the bunch of you, you'll think of ones that I never thought of, and try things I'll never get around to. I mean, you're a lot younger than I am, so you're going to live longer. Probably going to live longer. So that's where I wanted to end up, with practical examples so you could see what good the theory is. Because a theory that doesn't describe the world so well that we can then make the world what we want it to be is not the best theory. It's not the best theory. Some theories are true as far as they go, but they're not very helpful. The really good theories help us. Help us discover more about the world and help us discover how to cooperate with the world. So I'm done. You've got questions for your small groups. They're going to pick up at this place and go forward. But I'm going to give you a chance for questions and answers before we go to small groups.
So, you know who wrote Genesis? Specifically chapter 1, and what makes it credible?
Traditionally, the Hebrews thought that Moses wrote it. It's not utterly clear that the Bible itself says that Moses wrote it. It does say that Moses collected a bunch of stuff, and it does say that Moses gave a lot of prophecies that are preserved in some of the first 5 books of the Bible. It looks like, I mean, you remember God rescued the Israelites from Egypt and brought them into the land of Canaan and gave them the land of Canaan and eventually gave them conquest over the peoples there and let David build up a huge kingdom. And then David's descendants started trying to practice other religions too. I mean, they were still trying to practice the religion of Moses, but also other things as well. And eventually God said, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to strike you down. The northern kingdom's going to be hauled off into bondage by the Hittites, and 150 years later, Judah itself and Jerusalem will be overturned, and you'll go into captivity with the Babylonians. And during that time, trapped in Babylon, it looks like a lot of people said, boy, we really blew it. We'd better collect up everything that the prophets and the historians wrote about what God had done among us and collect it all together so we can see what God has done and know what God's word is for us. It looks like probably that's when they collected a lot of this stuff together. But who wrote it originally is not clear. Whoever it was didn't put his name on top of it. But that's probably when it was collected. Best guess, and I could be wrong, and history is